He's always with us.
Amen.
And that's why we need to be on our best. Because he's going to take a look inside what I call that human hard drive inside the heart. That time comes around. He also is in charge of time and situations. He's in charge of time and situations. He might not bring it to your attention now, but eventually you will get it. He controls wisdom. And he knows what's going to happen long before it's going to happen.
Amen.
You know, so if you're out there with the doors open, and like the pastor says in his sermon 2 weeks ago, don't talk too loud, because the devil's going to know when to walk in.
Amen.
You know, God's people were taken into custody by the Babylonians. They took them to captivity. And through the prophet Isaiah, God declared his judgment upon Babylon before the nation became a world power. Now, a few weeks ago, the lesson was on how Cyrus, who was a pagan, allowed and instructed his leaders to let God's people go back to their home. All of the gold and precious metals and jewels and everything that they plundered when they went and took over, he made sure they got back to them. He also made sure that all the funding, all of the livestock and everything that they had taken to possession, that they got back there. And it wasn't a situation that it took them a couple of weeks. This took a good period of time. So, with this, there were several situations that had occurred, and there's a pretty good time span of how that occurred. So it wasn't where God ensured that Babylon was taken care of right then. He let the door come open for them so that they could practice what they were practicing.
Right.
You know, so we're talking about the dependence on pagan practices, which include astrology, other dark magics. There were other things, you know, the constellations, patterns of star movements and all. That's what they depended on instead of depending on the Lord.
All right.
With this, and becoming more powerful, they thought that they were untouchable. You know, just as Pharaoh tried to run Moses off, when he had his guys to put his snakes down there, Moses laid his staff down there. His staff turned to a snake and ate Pharaoh's snakes up.
Amen.
Trying to show that you were not in charge. Well, God's going to show the Babylonians here that he was not, well, that they were not in charge. You know, the idol worshipship, oppression, and marginalization of the poor folks that were there, unfair business practices. I mean, it just fundamentally threatened God's law. Isaiah's calling was to serve God's message before the people of Judah and proclaim their sinful behavior. The sinfulness was demonstrated by disregard for God's law and his covenant claims on them as his people. There were prophecies against the sins that were taking place. And the prophecies were summarized as follows. If those whom God has called to be his own act as if they are not his people, then they will not be a people at all. You don't have to tell me that more than one time to know that something's fixing to happen.
Amen.
There were different signs that are out there that we all knew that something was going to take place. Does that remind us of something like the things going on today?
Amen.
We see some of the same thing. Again, it's not the first time it happened.
Amen.
That's why I say all the time, the answer is right there in between the two bookends called the Bible. There's nothing new that's taking place out in the world that ain't already happened. And the answer's right in there. So, Isaiah predicted that Cyrus, the future king of Persia, would release the captives, and he did. We discussed that before. And we're getting down into chapter 47, where God, through Isaiah's prophecies and his judgments upon Babylon. Again, remember that Isaiah prophesied over 100 years before the Babylonian captivity, which is where our lesson is going to pick up today in chapter 47, verse 10. Could someone read the verses, Isaiah chapter 47, verses 10 and 11?
For thou hast trusted in thy wickedness, thou hast said, none seeketh me. Thy wisdom and thy knowledge, it hath perverted thee, and thou hast said in thine heart, I am none else beside me. Therefore shall evil come upon thee. Thou shalt not know from whence it risen, and mischief shall fall upon thee. Thou shalt not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon thee suddenly, which thou shalt not know.
Wow. Those are pretty strong words there. There's something that'll make you think. Make people go, what is he talking about? Do an analysis of these. But the word thou, and it says thou, it refers to Babylon, whom the prophecy concerns. Wickedness was a show of power designed to enforce compliance by means of fear. Fear-mongering. A lot of psychological stuff into that. Also with that fear-mongering, but that sorcery and all that they were practicing, I guess people didn't know whether they were going to walk into a brick wall or they're going to wake up tomorrow morning.
All right.
Now we need to keep in mind that Isaiah was writing many decades before Babylon's rise as a world power. Yet so concerned is Isaiah's prophecy that he writes only in future tense, but also in past tense. You know, Paul has done that at times, and you can tell in his writings, and there was a difference in some of the writings that is within this book. Bible, he actually writes this. The phrase none seeth me implies that the Babylonian Empire viewed itself above accountability. You can't touch us. We got everything in line. We got our own gods. We read the stars and the different constellations out there. And the people of Judah and Jerusalem actually just felt guilty outside of the fear that they had. The scope of the word none mentioned in there can encompass the entirety of heaven and earth. The Babylonian Empire had not faced any consequences from either spirit, but exercising its enormous power inhumanly, which led to the supposition that unjust treatment was acceptable. They might make right. That was their way of life, to treat others wrong. That's what this is saying. Now, such philosophy still permeates in a lot of societies today. There are countries out there that's all that they practice. Fear-mongering. Well, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to hold back on your substance and all. But we take a look at what happened just for an example. Down in Venezuela, folks were eating out of the trash can.
Oh.
Not the dumpsters. they hoarded everything.
Wow.
So this is the type of situation that they had in Babylon. Where it says thy wisdom and thy knowledge, it hath perverted thee, and thou hast said in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. Again, thou. He's talking about the Babylonian Empire. This part of the verse speaks to an exercise in self-delusion. All true wisdom and knowledge begin in the fear of the Lord. He's getting a friend with notes of that. Claiming to be wise or knowledgeable apart from God's teaching is foolishness. Babylon trusted in its military and political might to the degree that it imagined its every move to have been mandated by small g God, their God. The other way to put it is that the empire ended up seeing itself as the small g God who justified its own actions. It twisted self-image that I am and none else besides me was a claim that their God was on their side. Temptation to set oneself up as a small g God proved itself irresistible throughout the generations. And if we take a look back, Adam and Eve in the garden sinned, because they also thought that they could be like God. He gave them everything. It was a beautiful place. They deserved it. They were cursed after that. So, where in 11, therefore shall evil become upon thee, and thou shalt not know from whence it riseth. The Hebrew word translated evil is the same word that was translated for wickedness. In the previous verse, this implies that a moral evil is to overtake Babylon. In context, it is clear that this sequence comes from the Lord as punishment for Babylon's deeds. We should note that God does not inflict moral evil over anyone. But God does not permit both moral and physical evils in allowing natural consequences of our own actions. And although God never inflicts moral evil, he is known to have strengthened a pre-existing evil resolve of people. In addition to inflicting what is called physical evil or natural disasters. Punishment would come as a shock to the Babylonians. They will neither foresee its coming nor be able to thwart it. Their sorceries and enchantments would be powerless to starve off God's wrath. Those must have been some evil people. I mean, totally evil. Lift off the oppression of the poor. You know, I say all the time, it's hard being a Christian. But you keep in mind what your final outcome would be, because each of us have a relationship with God.
Amen.
That's it.
Looking at it right now. He always knows where your heart is.
Yes.
Now, the Hebrew word translated in the second part of this verse here, mischief, occurs only 3 times in the Old Testament. Mischief is sort of a lighter word. You can take a look at the different levels of things. Evil, wickedness, I think you're about at the top of the line there. But mischief, And those are things that you can shun yourself from. You don't have to do it. And I hope that we don't even get involved in this lower level of wrongdoing. But it's used as a parallel description with evil at times in desolations. It may be tempting to try and discern the differences amongst these words, but it's more likely that the cumulative effect is intended. You know, the Babylonians could not impossibly imagine that they would have nothing that would present what's about to take place in them is coming. As we know, the pastor tells us all the time, if you take a look at the end times, and those different things that represent different countries,
Right.
talk about the lion, talk about the bear, guess what ain't there? The eagle. Doesn't even mention the eagle inside the Bible. In that section of the Bible, it doesn't. Just like Rome. Rome dismantled itself from within. It's like it says here, that the thing that's taking place today. And what they did. If I could get a reader to take a look at Stargazer, Isaiah 27, verses 12 and 13.
Stand now with thy enchantments, and with the multitude of thy sorceries within thou hast labored from thy youth. If so be thou shalt be able to profit, if so be thou mayest prevail. Thou art weary in the multitude of thy counsel. Let now thy astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly, what's that word? Prognosticated, stand up, save thee from these things that shall come upon thee.
Wow. So things like the opening to the old show, The Twilight Zone. Something we don't know it. Enhancements and sorceries were common practices ever since the early Egyptian days. This means to give people insight into their small gods' desires and intentions. In fact, Israel's faith was meant to be unique in ancient Near East for refusing such means to divine God's will, looking instead to his chosen prophets and their leaders. So the Israelites, knowing that they were God's chosen people, were already recognized that they should not go down the road. Although you're going to have a few bad apples in there in every group. It's there. But this is well was our job, their job, to try to assist them in leading themselves back on to the right path. Now, as I mentioned before, the magicians in Europe, in Egypt, were pretty successful in that, up to the point where Moses showed up and had that thing with the snakes and the other gods that the Egyptians had. You had that frog lady and the god of wind, and the one that took care of making sure they didn't have locusts and the fish god and all like that. But ours was a lot more powerful. Took Pharaoh just a small period of time to find out, and not knowing that that was a more powerful person than him. Basically, Isaiah is telling them the same thing. You know, I like that these people, these folks that are out there. What was her name? They come on television. The palm readers. Miss Cleo. Miss Cleo. Come on there. And, well, I'll read the palm. What are you concerned with?
Uh-oh.
You know, you give me $100, I'll tell you what you want to know.
That's right.
For that $100.
I had a friend of mine used to go all the way down to San Antonio every weekend to get a new phone.
Give away money.
You know, if you save your money and come up here, I'll read your phone for you.
Exactly.
You know, a prudent person would think that there has to be something in between that. If I have to go all these folks and listen to all these chantings and everything,
Amen.
all these cantations. Now, magic was not meant to be entertainment, but instead intended to manipulate the Babylonians' gods.
Exactly what it did.
Now, God cannot be, our God cannot be manipulated, and does not tolerate anyone trying to force his hand. There have been a few, but they're not around anymore. The astrologers, stargazers, and the monthly prognosticators all search the sky for signs of God's doing. Small g. The practice was especially prevalent in Babylon there. Calendars were drawn up based on the movements of the heavenly bodies. These calendars were believed to reveal blessed or cursed days so that the people could act appropriately. We should note that there was not a clear distinction between the practice of astrology and astronomy at that time. This distinction is well made today. However, the scientific study of the universe beyond the planet Earth is an opportunity to experience renewed awe of all that God has created. So there's a difference between astrology and astronomy on the scientific side. Okay? The astrologers study the other heavens and bodies that God has put out there for us to enjoy. So it's a pretty good distinction for that. They took it the wrong way. You know, I remember when I was coming up there at Birmingham, there was always, you had this section down in the paper to tell you the horoscope and, you know, and what everything is going to be for you. They watch out for this. If I go and eat Oreo food, I don't even read that stuff in the fortune cookie.
Me neither. I used to.
You know? Only God knows when good is going to come about.
Amen.
That's
Amen.
it right there.
And we all have been blessed.
Yes.
Amen.
We thank you, Lord.
So if they were depending on something, these soothsayers, and not for an illusional type deal where they're using magic, as a person would think, that's the way we look at magic nowadays, an illusion. But they were using it for religious and political purposes. It's called theocratic type life. Theocratic. There's a lot of countries in the Middle East use it. Now, watching the night sky led the wise men to a glorious discovery. We know about that. The three wise men. And that was an act of God. That wasn't because that they were out there reading the stars to know where to go. There was other acts that had taken place, especially when God brought them out of Egypt. And they had those clouds that they were following. They had night when it normally there was darkness, and they followed that cloud. But that was God's doing.
Amen.
That was not from cantations. That was not from magic. That was to get his people gathered.
Amen.
Now, God provides great mercy and willingness to meet people where they are literally led to seek Jesus. And in Babylon's case, even these stargazers were correct in their predictions and knew when and what shall come upon Babylon. they will not be able to find a way to save their nation. And I say all the time, if there's a human element involved, there's room for failure, including how we live. You know, it doesn't take much or long for you to find out where you stand with God when things started to coming at you. If I had an opportunity to attend a satanic crime course, and you can't hurt anybody for their religion, but you can for the practices within their religion. Sacrifices, other different things that fall into the same category here we're talking about with the Babylonians. That was magic, voodoo, all of those different things fall under the satanic umbrella. Well outside of what it says in the Bible and what the practice of God likes us to practice every day. The only problem is that everyone does not believe what the outcome of what those practices are. We as Christians have always shown ourselves away from that. The only ones that were really strong on that in Babylon was one group of people that were all believers in themselves. Nothing else on the outside. I tell you this for an example, and me is speaking for one of these Babylonians. I don't want you to know anything else outside of what I tell you.
Amen.
You just listen to me. And I'll tell you what needs to be done. Put that book down and stop reading. That sound familiar to all of us? I don't want to know you. I don't want you to know anything different. It's conditioning these folks. So they also use that along with the fear mongering to have them conditioned. You notice none of these passages here are they telling them that y'all need to worship our small g God. It doesn't tell them that. Isaiah didn't mention that. These Israelites already known within themselves which God that they should be working with and they should be worshiping. They brought that with them when the Babylonians came and conquered them. Now if you sit down and think about it, he's telling them this stuff, and then you had a pagan king to come along and turn them loose. That's the way God works. That's the way he works. If I can get a volunteer to read Isaiah 47, verses 14 and 15.
Surely they,
15.
14 and 15.
Surely they are like stubble. Fire will burn them up. They cannot even save themselves from the power of the flame. These are not cold or warm. This is not a fire to sit by. That is all they are to you. These you have dealt with and labored with since childhood. All of them go on in their error. There is not one that can save you.
amen.
Wow. Here it says, surely they, that they refers to those wise ones. That's the same group of people also to right within themselves. We're the only ones who should be in the know. You just listen to what I tell you, don't do anything else. Those who were trusted to read the sky and guide the people to the right actions based on what they saw. These learned men were thought to be a source of light in the form of knowledge, and thus safe to do with wise living. But instead, these very counselors would be able would be the stubble that feeds the fire. It's like throwing them on the wood. There's more firewood. Now, instead, these counselors were going to be part of the blaze that is going to guide the Israelites back to where they should be. Not only was Isaiah talking to the Babylonians, he was also there with the Israelites that know well ahead of time what was going to happen and what the outcome was going to be. This is like 100 years before it even took place. We all are versed and know what our outcome would be. It's hanging back there on that sign is on the wall. You inherited that just by being born in God's earth. Accepting it, it's up to us. Now, riches, which these counselors were, these top of the line folks, allowed them to feel safe. What I mean by being safe, we're running everything. A person that had riches back in those days thought they were already blessed. I'm blessed because I'm rich. I'm going to keep reading the stars. Come back and tell you how you should be living your life. Now, though Babylon had believed those friends were like a homely fire to them, a homely type fire to keep them warm, it wasn't like that. That's why they insisted, and you have to continue to be fed this time and time again, so that you would believe. You know, when we were all born, you came there without the knowledge in the world. And you were put in a situation where you had to depend on your parents. If you take a look at all of our lives, if you had to draw a circle around Francis Milton, what's part of his life? Church, school, friends, neighbors, relatives, all of those things would be around me. They were the influences. These Israelites were not afforded that. They were not afforded that whatsoever. So eventually it would wind up that the Babylonians and all of their allies were destined for doom. None of the stars, which belong to God, none of the moon, which belong to God, any of the other things that they practice out there to continue to poison the Israelites' mind would save them. God is not surprised at what happened amongst and within the nations of the world. We all know we have things that's taking place right now. Probably in corners of the earth that we didn't even know existed. But God's there with it. There are other verses in the Bible that talks about the outcome of different nations. We Christians do well to remember and trust that God sees injustice and violence around us and has a plan to right all wrongs. Though our enemies They never see the error of their ways and repent. We know that our faith in God is not misplaced. And it will result in our seeing this plan come to fruition. Faith in anything else results in disappointment, misplaced priorities. We still see those things that take place today. But you know how your life gets to be a lot easier as you're going through and you learn things. Sometimes you say yourself, man, I wish I'd known that earlier.
Amen.
Maybe it was not what God meant for me to have.
Amen.
But I'm happy. I'm pretty healthy. I'm still here. And I thank God for what he does.
Amen.
But the commercial today, you bought $10 in the Bitcoin, it'd be worth $200-some $10 10 years later. That wasn't it. And it's not always money. It's like these guys here because they were richer, but they had always been blessed. They see that the blessing is going to fall short. So if we trust his timing and wait patiently, one of those words that we talked about last week in Bible school, the old list. You have the flesh list and the fruit list. Patience is one of those. We trust in his timing and wait patiently for the day. He will come back and take care of the wickedness once for all. Because his promises are steadfast. Now, we cannot imagine all of the things that takes place in the world and think about the burden that would have on us individually as a person. Individually. All of the weight that God had on his shoulders, we would not be able to bear. He took a lot of that weight off our shoulders when he got out there on that cross. He didn't run, he didn't go hide. But one thing that you can always trust in is Jesus Christ himself. When you see him, get up in the morning and look in the mirror, it's all around. Walk and live your life in freedom. That's the way God wants you to be. Something you might want to keep in mind with this lesson. If God's enemies will eventually fall, if his enemies will eventually fall, why are people still hanging out? You know, on that good side of the street, stay on. All right. That's our lesson for today. Anybody want to review? Come on, sir.